Every speaker in Klipsch's heritage line still gets hand-built, cabinet by cabinet, inside the same small Arkansas factory that opened in 1946, using methods still never assisted by robotics. And this is the inside story of that factory and every speaker that carries its name. I went through Klipsch's own official list of its founders' most significant designs, all 7 names on it, every heritage model still in production, and the company's own founder archive, to figure out how many of these stories actually survive in the record. Most people assume a speaker company this old got swallowed by outsourcing decades ago, the way almost every other American audio brand did. And for most of what carries the Klipsch name today, that assumption is correct. But the Hope, Arkansas plant is still running. No robots on the line, just hands, glue, and wood. Up to 12 hours of labor on a single cabinet. 7 names appear on Klipsch's own official list of its founders' most significant designs. 3 of those 7 look, at first glance, like they've vanished from the record entirely. And one speaker in that lineup has been in continuous production for over 70 years. The only loudspeaker in the world that can claim that. The company's own marketing sums up the whole philosophy in 4 words. Big sound, no bullshit. I'm saving the story of the man who started it, alone, with his own hands, for the very end, along with the line he said would only be proven wrong if the laws of physics changed. In 1958, Klipsch built a compact speaker called the H8. Only 16 of them were ever made. It wasn't built for a shelf. It was built to sit between 2 other speakers and anchor the voices in the middle, a job Klipsch's own archives call a center channel design, decades before home theater made that term common. For 68 years, the H8 existed only as a design reference, a footnote so rare that most Klipsch fans never even knew its name. Then, on June 4, 2026, at the high-end show in Vienna, Klipsch stood on a stage and announced something they had never done before, a bookshelf speaker for the heritage line. They called it the Rebellion, and they said it plainly in the press materials, that it is based on Paul W. Klipsch's original 1958 design for the H8. The company's own words were direct. There was no more appropriate way to start than with an original PWK design. For years, heritage fans had been asking for a smaller option, something that didn't need a living room built around it the way a Klipschorn does. And Klipsch kept saying no, that wasn't the tradition. Then they said yes, using a design so old it had almost vanished from memory. Here's what makes it stranger. The heritage line started with the Klipschorn in 1946, and the Rebellion is described as the first bookshelf speaker Klipsch has ever built for that entire line. Not the 10th attempt, the first. 68 years of horn-loaded floor standers, corner speakers, center channels, and not one bookshelf model, until a rediscovered ghost from 1958 got hand-built again in Hope, Arkansas. Every pair uses grain-matched wood veneer panels cut from the same piece of timber, so no 2 Rebellion cabinets in the world look exactly alike. Klipsch tied the launch to its 80th anniversary with a limited tigerwood finish, turning a commercial failure, a speaker that never sold more than 16 units, into the flagship story of an anniversary celebration. A design that couldn't find a market in 1958 became, in 2026, the proof that Klipsch still keeps its oldest promises, bringing heritage horn sound into small rooms for the first time in company history. And the H8 carried an internal name inside the company that will matter again before this story is over. The Rebellion isn't the only recent proof that Hope still builds by hand. Some of what comes out of that factory floor today doesn't even wear the heritage name. Not every speaker built in Hope, Arkansas looks like it belongs in 1946. Some of them look like they belong in a modern home theater. Klipsch calls the RF72 the flagship speaker in the popular reference series lineup, and it doesn't share a single design cue with the Klipschorn's corner horn shape. No exposed wood grain, no 1940s silhouette. It's a modern tower, built for surround sound systems and contemporary living rooms. And yet Klipsch's own blog places it inside the same category as the heritage models, designed and assembled in the USA, built on the same factory floor in Hope. Its partner speaker makes the point even harder to miss. The RC64-2 is described as the most powerful center channel in the reference series, carrying 4 separate 6.5-inch cerametallic woofers inside one cabinet. Klipsch's own materials say it's hand-assembled on the line in Hope, the same line, the same building, the same hands that finish a Klipschorn. The company pairs the two together in its own marketing as the ideal flagship pairing, a floor stander and a center channel meant to sit side by side in a home theater. In one line of their own copy, describing the RC64-2 as the perfect companion to the RF72, Klipsch left in a typo, calling it the perfect complement instead of compliment. Small detail, but it's the kind of thing that slips through when actual people are writing the copy, not committees. Here's what makes these two different from everything else Klipsch sells outside the heritage name. When the reference line moved to its next generation, the RF73 and RC643, Klipsch's own UK launch materials specified something almost nobody noticed. Those two, and only those two, remained the sole reference line models still designed and assembled in the Hope, Arkansas factory. Every other reference speaker on the shelf next to them had already gone overseas. So the RF7 and RC64 aren't a marketing gimmick borrowing Hope's reputation. They're the exact dividing line where Klipsch drew the border between what stays hand-built and what doesn't, generation after generation. And the RF7-2 and RC64-2 sat on the right side of that line before anyone made it official. Which raises an obvious question. If craftsmanship survived into the modern reference lineup, why did three of Paul Klipsch's own original designs, speakers he considered important enough to build with his own hands, look, from a distance, like they'd nearly vanished from the record entirely? Klipsch's own company biography names them directly, in the same sentence as the Klipschorn itself: Rebel, Shorthorn, and Bell Klipsch. The founder's page calls them among the most well-known loudspeakers developed by Paul W. Klipsch, placing them shoulder to shoulder with Heresy, Cornwall, and La Scala, speakers that still sell today, speakers with entire fan communities built around them. At a glance, they look like the three names nobody bothered to write down. They aren't. Klipsch's own product archive still carries a page for the Rebel. First introduced in 1949, manufactured until 1958, with a bigger variant, the Rebel 4, running from 1955 to 1958 alongside it. That makes the Rebel older than the Klipschorn's three-way redesign, one of the earliest speakers Klipsch ever put his name on outside the original corner horn. The Shorthorn has an even longer paper trail, built from roughly 1955 through 1965 across several variants, including an experimental Model T version with fewer than 200 pairs made. And Paul Klipsch himself, years later, said out loud what the sales brochures never did. The Shorthorn was a bad speaker. Not a rumor, not a gap in the record. An admission from the man who built it that one of his own designs simply didn't work the way he wanted it to. Bell Klipsch has the fullest story of the three, and it isn't a mystery, it's a tribute. Klipsch introduced it in 1971, essentially the La Scala's acoustic performance dressed in a more cosmetically refined cabinet. And he named it after his first wife, Eva Bell Hulling Klipsch, the woman who kept the company's books as its secretary, and who he'd been married to since 1928. She died in 1976, 5 years after the speaker went into production. Bell Klipsch stayed in the catalog until it was discontinued in the mid-1990s. It isn't that Klipsch's history goes quiet on these three names. It's that the record on them was never a mystery to begin with. Once you go looking for it, an early speaker that predates most of the heritage lineup, a design its own inventor called a failure, and a floor stander literally named for his wife, which makes it worth asking what happened to the three names that grew, instead, into speakers people still buy new today. In 1957, Paul Klipsch built a speaker meant to sit between two Klipschorns, and he gave it a name that mocked his own principles. He called it Heresy, and by the company's own later telling, the name was a private joke turned public. A direct radiating speaker, one that didn't rely purely on horn loading the way his other designs did, was a kind of heresy against everything he'd built his reputation on. Internally, though, Klipsch and his own staff had a different name for it first. They called it the Model H, and the Model H wasn't a name that disappeared after 1957. It kept getting used for years afterward, on later variants of the same idea, refined and reworked, one of which was a rare two-way version built in 1958. Klipsch's own materials call that 1958 version the H8. Only 16 were made. It's the same speaker from Chapter 1. The Rebellion isn't a rediscovered ghost from an unrelated corner of the archive. It's a lost branch of the same tree that grew into the heresy. One Klipsch is only now grafting back on, 68 years later. And yet he built the original anyway, because a center channel needed a different shape than a corner horn allowed. The company describes it plainly. As far as anyone can tell, it's the first commercially made center channel speaker in the industry. Not just a Klipsch first, an industry first. 2 years later, in 1959, came the speaker Klipsch's own team calls the Heresy's big brother. They named it Cornwall, and the name itself is a portmanteau. built to work in a corn, or against a wall. It was bigger, more powerful, and flexible enough to anchor a room on its own, instead of just filling a gap between two other speakers. Today, the current version, the Cornwall IV, gets called heirloom quality, in Klipsch's own materials, handmade in the same factory where it was first produced, nearly 7 decades later. Then, in 1963, came the speaker that solved the one real limitation of the Klipschorn itself, and it wasn't built for anyone's living room at all. La Scala was designed as a public address loudspeaker for Winthrop Rockefeller's Arkansas gubernatorial campaign, shipped out in raw, unfinished wood, so campaign staff could paint each cabinet to match whatever hall or church or club it was playing in that week. Rockefeller liked it enough to mount it inside a campaign train car and haul it across the state. It was named after the Teatro alla Scala in Milan, a nod to the opera house tradition of live orchestral sound, and it was fully horn-loaded, just like the Klipschorn, but it didn't require a corner to work. A speaker built to survive a political campaign turned out to be good enough that people wanted it in their living rooms instead. La Scala too carries the concept forward today, with updated cabinetry and components, but the same core idea. What ties all three together is the logic behind them. Heresy solved the center channel problem. Cornwall solved the big room problem. La Scala solved the placement problem, after first solving a much stranger problem: how to survive being loaded on and off a train for a governor's race. 3 different answers to 3 different rooms, all descended from one 1946 idea, and all 3, along with the Klipschorn itself, still listed by Klipsch today as manufactured and sold around the world. Enthusiasts describe listening to them as something close to a religious experience, and a 2026 documentary on the company shows the current Heresy 4 and Cornwall 4 photographed against real wood grain and warm lighting, the same visual language Klipsch has used for decades to say one thing: these are still hand-built in Hope, Arkansas, priced in the thousands, exactly the way they always were. Which leaves one question hanging over every single one of these names, from the Rebellion to the Cornwall 4. What does it actually look like, physically, for a cabinet to get built by hand in that factory today? Walk onto the floor in Hope, Arkansas today, and here's the first thing that won't be there: a robot. Klipsch's own factory profile is direct about it. Cabinets are assembled, outfitted, and finished by hand, and never with the assistance of robotics. That's not a marketing flourish. It's a description of a physical process that happens the same way, 5 days a week, in a building that's been standing since Paul Klipsch first put down roots there. Picture the bench. A craftsperson selects wood veneer panels cut from the same piece of timber, so the grain lines up across a matched pair, the way it's done for the Rebellion and every other heritage cabinet. That veneer gets applied by hand to a cabinet that can weigh close to 200 pounds, wet with glue, and there's no machine clamping it down. A person checks every seam, sets the clamps, and then walks away, because the glue needs time. Nobody rushes that part. No robotic arm, no injection mold, no assembly line. Just a man, a bench, and a slow-drying pot of glue. Depending on the size and complexity of the speaker, the whole build runs anywhere from 40 minutes to 12 hours, and for something the size of a Klipschorn, it sits at the long end of that range. Inside the cabinet, the work keeps going. The horn-loaded base bin gets glued and sealed by hand, because if the internal acoustic pathway isn't airtight, the horn doesn't behave the way Klipsch designed it to behave. Crossovers get soldered onto heavy boards, one joint at a time. None of this arrives at the factory already finished. Components converge on Hope from all over the country. Drivers and tweeters from Bossier City, woofers like the K33 from Eminence, Kentucky, grills from Chicago, and woodstock from California and Indiana. All of it lands in one small Arkansas town so it can be turned into a finished speaker by somebody standing at a bench with a torque driver and a pot of glue. Arkansas Business once put the plant's headcount at 73. A more recent count, tied to the company's Indianapolis headquarters, put it lower, around 45 in Hope against 74 at headquarters, out of roughly 145 employees company-wide, a sign of just how small this operation has stayed, even as the brand around it grew. Other recent accounts describe those same craftspeople turning out well over 1,000 speakers a month between them. And here's the part that matters most, because it would be easy to assume otherwise. Some components for Klipsch's core electronics lines are now made overseas, shipped in, and most products carrying the Klipsch name today are soundbars and wireless earbuds assembled in China. Hope is the exception to that, not the rule. Walk through that building and you won't find an abandoned brick shell repurposed into lofts, the way so many old American factories ended up. You'll find an active, humming manufacturing facility, doing the same job in the same territory, where the first Klipschorns came out of the basement of the old telephone exchange building, decades ago. That's the process. Hands, glue, wood, and time. But the company that runs that factory today isn't the same company Paul Klipsch built it inside of, and the story of how it changed hands, twice, says almost as much about what survived as the factory floor does. In 1989, at 85 years old, Paul Klipsch sold the company he'd started in a tin shed to his cousin, Fred Klipsch. Manufacturing of the heritage speakers stayed exactly where it had always been, in Hope. But the business itself didn't. Operations moved to Indianapolis, Indiana, and the company took on a new name, Klipsch, Inc. The sale marked the point where, by many accounts, the business became different, more commercial, more modern. What followed was expansion in every direction Paul Klipsch himself had never chased. Lifestyle products, home theater systems, eventually soundbars, and later wireless earbuds. Categories that didn't exist when Klipsch was hand-molding fiberglass horns in the 1940s. Then, in March 2011, the company changed hands again. Audiovox Corporation, a consumer electronics group later renamed Vox International, bought Klipsch Group outright for $166 million. Fred Klipsch, still chairman, stayed on to run it as a standalone unit inside somebody else's balance sheet. The company that today builds every Klipschorn and every Cornwall by hand in Hope is, on paper, a subsidiary of a publicly traded electronics conglomerate on the NASDAQ. Globalization split the brand in two, without anyone ever announcing it as a split. On one side, mass-market electronics, built overseas, sold under the same logo. On the other, a small crew of hand builders in Arkansas, still gluing cabinets the same way, still sourcing wood from California and Indiana, still refusing robots, now two ownership changes removed from the man whose name is on the building. Paul Klipsch didn't disappear from the story once the first set of papers were signed. In 1997, 5 years before his death, he was inducted into the Engineering and Science Hall of Fame, a formal recognition of a body of work that had, by then, spanned more than 50 years. Later brand documents would even take his personal engineering beliefs, high efficiency, low distortion, controlled directivity, and formalize them into official company pillars, printed in corporate materials for employees who never met him, and who now, in many cases, work for a company 2 acquisitions removed from the one he sold. One man's stubborn theories about physics turned into policy, then turned into a line item on somebody else's earnings call. There's no lawsuit in this part of the story. No recall, no scandal, no investigation. The drama here isn't crisis. It's endurance. A company that changed ownership twice, changed headquarters, changed product categories, went public inside a company that isn't even primarily an audio brand, and somehow still let one factory keep doing exactly what it had always done. Which brings the story back to where it has to end. Not with either sale, not with Indianapolis, but with the one man whose hands started all of it. In a building smaller than most people's garages. Every speaker in this story, the Rebellion, the RF-72, the Cornwall 4, the ones that only looked forgotten, traces back to one man who couldn't get investors to take him seriously, so he built the whole thing himself. Paul W. Klipsch received a patent on the low-frequency section of his corner horn loudspeaker design in 1945. In 1946, he registered Klipsch & Associates in Hope, Arkansas, and for the first 2 years, he built every single speaker with his own 2 hands. He didn't hire his first employee until 1948. Hope didn't have the industrial infrastructure to support him at first, so the earliest cabinets were built by a local business, Reed's Cabinet Shop, while Klipsch built the horn assembly himself. He'd ended up in that town almost by accident. During World War II, he'd served at the Southwest Proving Ground, right there in Hope, and afterward, he bought part of the proving ground for 10 cents on the dollar. He rented an 11 by 22-foot tin shack behind a dry cleaner for $10 a month, and when asked why Hope, his answer was almost offhand. Being a central location would be a good place to build a plant, he said, and he didn't have any roots anywhere else. He didn't even name his own creation. Years later, on a sales call to a prospect in New York, he mentioned his corner horn and the man cut him off. "We've heard all about it. We call it the Klipschorn." Klipsch kept the name. He hadn't thought of it himself. Now picture the inside of that shed, sometime in 1946. It's cramped, barely enough room to turn around with a cabinet in your arms. Klipsch is standing at a single workbench. There's no crew, no assembly line, no second set of hands to hold a panel steady while he glues it. He's cutting wood himself, shaping the horn throat by hand, wiring the crossover point by point, testing it against his own ear, because there's no one else's ear to test it against. He's not building this speaker to sell 1,000 units. He's building it because he wants live music in his own living room. Outside, Hope, Arkansas goes about its business. A small town that has no idea it's about to become permanently linked to a piece of audio equipment. It doesn't even have a name yet, not the name that will end up on it. Inside the shed, one man finishes gluing a joint, sets it down to dry, and walks away for the night. The same slow, patient process that, 80 years later, workers in a much bigger building down the road, now several ownership changes removed from him, are still doing, panel by panel, cabinet by cabinet, without a robot in sight. The design barely moved from that night forward. Klipsch's own company puts it plainly. It may be hard to believe, but the design of the Klipschorn has genuinely not changed much since PWK made his first one in 1946. There was one real evolution in 1951 and 1952 when the Klipschorn converted from a two-way to a three-way system, adding a dedicated tweeter, squawker, and woofer to keep pace with rising expectations for frequency response. The same period Klipsch patented the high-frequency section of the design to go with the low-frequency patent from 1945. Beyond that, the shape, the horn loading principle, the corner placement, all of it has held for close to 80 years. Klipsch himself never softened into a company statesman. The company describes him bluntly as a genius, madman, and maverick, and he backed that up with his own words. When he read an audio magazine advertisement in the 1960s that struck him as ridiculous, he had a button made, yellow, one word on it, and he'd hand it to people making exaggerated marketing claims about their own products. His stated philosophy never wavered either. My theories on audio and audio reproduction will be proven wrong only when the laws of physics change. What he built in that tin shed is, today, described by his own company as the only speaker in the world that has been in continuous production for over 70 years. Not a reissue, not a tribute model built to resemble the original. The same design, refined once in the early 1950s, still built to order in premium hardwoods, still assembled by hand, still coming out of Hope, Arkansas, still owned, on paper, by a company on the other side of two separate sales he never lived to see. A man who bought war surplus land for 10 cents on the dollar, working alone in a rented shed for $10 a month, created the longest unbroken production run any loudspeaker has ever had. He never lived to see it reach 70 years. He built it to last that long from the very first joint he glued. The Klipschorn's unbroken run answers one question and opens another. Because the man who built it alone in that tin shed wasn't the only engineer of his generation working without a safety net, without investors, without a company behind him. Another one built his entire reputation and an entire industry's worth of studio and stage sound out of a personal tragedy nobody talks about anymore. That story is waiting in The James B. Lansing Story Explained, How One Man's Tragedy Built an Audio Empire. Go watch it next.